So we're gonna wait for a few minutes while people are joining. It's 6 p.m. 6 p.m. straight. So we can see that the room quickly filling in. In the meantime, Oksana, if you want to start, or just let's start actually in a minute, so other people don't miss out on our introduction. Because it's very important. I also wanted to remind you, and I know you always remember, but it's very important. Those webinars, we want to add as much value as possible, and also we want to remind our valuable, attendees and our network that we are here to help raise funding for your projects. I'm going to be sharing. Later I will announce again, but I'll be sharing some links where you can upload projects. But in the meantime, Oksana, the floor is yours. You can do a bit of an introduction.
Okay, great. I think we have quite a few people who are actually coming back to our webinar. So I think they already heard my introduction quite a few times. But those who haven't, I will be very brief. Basically, very interesting topic today about how to align future trends and challenges in investment opportunities in relation to circular economy. And yes, so basically, yes, circular economy principles, yes, and aligning sustainability with circular economy principles. When I spoke to Chris and he kind of shared this topic, I thought, wow, this is quite cool. I like how, like I will introduce Chris shortly, but his take and the angle he actually talks about, he discusses. And evident by number of registration and how many personal messages I got about the topic, it's obviously struck the chord. It's the first time, Vlad, it's the first time we discuss circular economy, right?
Probably yes.
So I think our network kind of appreciated it. It struck the chord. Hence, we're actually expecting some really, there was a lot of registration, over 300 registrations we had, right? I mean, it's pretty standard for our, but still, it's somewhat niche discussion. But anyway, so thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know us, we are QPQ International, focused on securing world-class partners and funders for green energy projects. We work with renewable energy, waste to energy, hydrogen production, and energy storage. So if you have, if you're developing a project in any of the, with any of the technologies that I just mentioned, we are here to add value. We have a very extensive investor network, established strategic relationships with investors, where investors already kind of like treat us as their go-to place for the origination. We know the requirements of our investors, so we can feedback and we can help you basically prepare your project in advance and add value in relation to prepare your project documentation. And so, yeah, so we have a team and all value chain geared towards helping you, yes? So this is a series that this webinar is a series that we conduct on an ongoing basis. It's a part of our Funding Accelerator program. So many of you from our network already participate in this program. So now in terms of, I'm just curious how many people are here that are new completely, and those who already been, seen our webinars before. We have a chat window. If you could just kind of like mention is like first time or been before, it would be quite useful, right, Vlad? I'm just
yeah, and I will I'll step in here as well in regards to the technical part using chat and Q&A, because we used to do our webinars on a different platform, so we have switched to Zoom some time ago. Most of you are familiar with Zoom, but it has instead of just chat, it also has Q&A button at the, well, for me it appears at the bottom in the navigation panel. So that's where you ask questions. We want to make this session as interactive as possible. Chris has allowed for some time to have a good amount of time for Q&A session. So please share your questions as Chris presents. I will be accumulating those questions, and then we will ask him in the end of the session. Also, for those who joined a little bit later, I announced in the beginning that I will be sharing some in the chat section. I will be sharing presentations, Chris's and our presentation, and also a couple of links which you can use to share your projects or projects that you from your network. We also run a very comprehensive referral program. So you either upload the information about the project, very brief information, then we'll reach out to you on the link that I'm gonna share, or you just send it to me directly. I will put my email here as well. And just a reminder, Chris prompted me that we have to inform everyone that the webinar is being recorded, so everyone knows, and those who are gonna miss out, we're gonna share the recording link as well.
Great. So without further kind of ado, let me introduce Chris Whyte. I'm very excited to have Chris here with us today. Chris is the international speaker, renowned speaker and strategist on circular economy, thought leader. So with incredible and extensive track record in sustainability, expert on Africa, but then of course very kind of incredible world integrated expertise, so which Chris will be sharing with our audience today. Chris, thank you very much. I think you will be much better at introducing yourself, but I thought that I kind of I'll do initial introduction. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll leave stage to you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And I have enabled the screen sharing, so it should be okay for you to present your screen. We will go off stage, not to clutter the screen of attendees, and then but we will be able to hear you. If you need anything, just yell out, and I'll connect back again, and I will be taking care of the questions, so we can do the Q&A session once you finish with your presentation. All right.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to get this into the screen mode. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but nothing comes up in terms of the presentation yet. It says that Chris Whyte has started screen sharing, but it's just black screen.
It's not coming up on my side either. That's unusual.
And it's always goes smooth when we test at the end, then.
Aha, there we go. All right, can you see that now?
Not yet, no. It doesn't, nothing, okay, something's coming up. Yeah, now it's on. Okay, now I will switch off my video and microphone and let you continue.
Great, thank you very much. Right, so thank you all for being here. As I said to QPQ, it's actually going to be quite interesting for me to look at making a presentation to potentially a much different crowd than I'm used to. I have done this a few times before, so if any of you are in the room who've heard me before, you're probably going to see a few similar slides. But it was quite interesting. QPQ came and said, we really want to try and chat about the circular economy topic. And I'm pretty much a purist when it comes to circular economy. And I think that the conversation went very quickly in terms of making sure that I try and change this towards understanding the financing side, which is fair enough. I think that we need to look at this as a critical issue going forward, specifically with regards to the fact that if you look at financing the circular economy, it's largely relegated at this stage to incubators and grant type funding and small scale projects. In reality, we want to try and get this into mainstream finance, and partly what I'm going to try and do today is to explain to the guests who are attending what that means, and what it means not only to me, but what it means to you, and why it is something that we need to look at quite specifically. So what we're going to try and do today is we're going to look at the issue around these future challenges. What are the trends going to be in investment in the years to come? And how do we look at unpacking these opportunities by looking at the circular economy applications? And we're going to look at a few different components here. We're going to understand the global north and the global south and the opportunities that we're looking at there, future-proofing investment and understanding the global alignments, and then looking at strategic initiatives with critical resources, as well as economic opportunities in decarbonization or carbon sequestration, carbon offsets, And then looking potentially at the just energy transition, some of the issues, for example, around the new Green Deal and opportunities in Africa. So I'm hoping that I can shed some light on this. But I'm going to give you a little bit more information, first of all, about who I am. So I've been in the sector for 30 plus years, and the opportunity really is, from my focus perspective, has been understanding technological interventions in determining economic opportunities and creating value chains in problematic waste streams. That's really where I've come from. Most of my opportunities are looking at the innovation side and understanding the economics behind that. So a little bit more about me. As I said, I'm a circular economy strategist. I've been called many things in my lifetime. Every time they change the buzzword, I change my designation. So apparently now I'm a circular economy specialist. Some people years ago used to call me the recycling guy, but I'm going to try and dispel some of those myths today. So one of the things that I do is I'm a director of the African Circular Economy Network. That is the de facto go-to organization in Africa for looking at circular developments. ASIN is now present in 42 African countries with over 800 members and some 10,000 followers. But we've aligned that also with the ASIN Foundation. So looking at the North-South cooperation between ASIN and Trinomics, which is based in Brussels, we have started the ASIN Foundation in 2021. That now has regional coordinators in Nigeria, Cameroon, Egypt, Ethiopia, and South Africa. And the idea is to drive the agenda around capacity. What is circular economy? How do we look at the opportunity not only from a bottom-up but from a top-down approach? And how do we align globally with network partners in this initiative? I also started an organization called Use It, which I ran from 2009 to 2020, that created thousands of jobs in the sector and earned me some 12, 13 national awards and 5 global awards for the work that I'm doing. But just to try and put it into context, I'm not just about the information. I also run a number of different commercial organizations in South Africa and Mauritius. And so I understand the commercial aspects as well. It's not just about the education, the advocacy. I think that's important. But my focus is projects. I want to make sure that we put projects on the ground and ensure that, that we transition Africa to a circular economy by looking at this from a project investment perspective. So there's a number of big problems we face, not only across Africa, but across the globe. One of those is landfill and waste management. There's been a lot of change in the European context, particularly avoiding landfill by going to the likes of incineration. The world is now moving away from incineration and waste to energy type applications, particularly at a large commercial heat and power type plants. Not to say that it's out of the window, it just means that the technology is changing. But there are literally hundreds of millions of tons landfill annually, and our recycling rates are low. Recycling is not the silver bullet. We are not going to solve our problems by recycling our way out of the waste issue. Housing and infrastructure is also a critical issue. If you look at it from a climate change perspective, the built environment contributes some 39% of all carbon emissions that contribute to global warming. And this provides a number of opportunities specifically for low carbon system development and material requirements to meet future opportunities. Understanding that a lot of the infrastructure that we require by 2050 is still has not been built. So we need to move away from things like cement and concrete. Cement is the world's most common building material, which by its own contributes some 8% of all carbon emissions that contribute to global warming. And maybe not in Europe, but certainly in Africa and other parts of the developing nations, we have a massive problem with regards to unemployment. And particularly in the developing nations, in South Africa, officially we're at about 33, 34%. It is well over 50% unemployment. And that also means that in terms of moving forward, we need to look at future-proofing skills. The skills we're teaching now are not going to get us out of the mess. We need to look at understanding what are the skills that are required for a future greening and circularity requirement. The other big problem that we face is energy, and this is a global issue. It's not only in terms of those that don't have energy, it's those that do have energy and are having to transition to a greener energy. And I think we all know in terms of some of the political issues in Europe and Asia at the moment, that this has caused a number of upsets, particularly in terms of global supply chains, energy prices, and a number of other economic issues. However, the global north is on a mission to decarbonize. So the idea is, if you look at the new Green Deal and a lot of the other EU regulations are really around decarbonization. And the simple reality is that where we are currently with regards to renewables, specifically around wind and solar, is that we're not going to renewable our way out of this. We need to also address issues around baseload, particularly in terms of industries that require a lot of energy. In Africa, we have a different situation. In Africa, we have about 650 million people who have absolutely no access to electricity. And this has also mass resultant issues in terms of things like deforestation. In Africa, we're looking at about 4.4 million hectares of deforestation per year. Put that in perspective, everyone thinks of the Amazon. The Amazon's about 1.5 million hectares per year. So Africa's in a real trouble, and a lot of that really goes to issues around charcoal, because charcoal is the primary energy source in terms of cooking and heating. That has impacts in terms of effectively decimating the lungs of the planet, which means that also contributes to things like biodiversity loss and land use change, which contributes to climate change, etc. And that really is the final problem that we're looking at in terms of climate change. I could go into an entire presentation on this. I'm a geologist originally by training. So I have very scientific and very strong views in terms of climate change. And some people might not like the way that I put this forward, but I think that the reality is that the issue around the land use change, the decimation of biodiversity, the population growth, the issues around that are critical in terms of ensuring that we drive a sustainable future forward. And this means we need to understand policy. We need to look at changing the terms and conditions of the financial sector. That a lot of people are a bit scared about, but I think let's rather not look at the fear factor. Let's rather identify where those opportunities are. So what is the circular economy? Effectively, there's a number of different definitions for the circular economy. The most common one is that from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which is the fact that it's based on 3 key principles. Those principles are driven by design. And the first is to eliminate waste and pollution. The second is to circulate products and materials, particularly at the highest value for as long as possible. And then to regenerate nature. The circular economy is a resilient system that's good for business, people, and the environment. The problem is that a lot of this jargon really means that the circular economy is often misinterpreted as just another buzzword for recycling. And the reality is that this could not be further from the truth. So we need to look at circular economy rather as a systemic transition to a sustainable and prosperous future that has a multi-sectoral impact on every sector. And this is important because a lot of people think it's about waste, but the sectors include energy, water, waste, infrastructure, transport, manufacturing, tourism, agriculture, and mining. And these all come with direct positive outcomes for the environment and biodiversity, as well as health and education. So part of this really is this transition allows us to achieve the goals of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It allows us opportunities to look at reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It allows us the opportunity to mitigate climate change, as well as achieving the global goals and meeting our nationally determined contributions to our global climate change commitments, for example, with the UNFCCC. So it's a very complicated systemic transition. This is not just about waste products. And please, I try and get this across in every talk that I do. It's not just about waste. Waste has as a key opportunity to looking at different components. But we also need to look at the upscale side of things, or the higher components in the hierarchy, where if we look at reduction, reuse, recycling, refurbishment, etc. So redesign and all these different components are critical to driving a circular economy, as well as components around digitalization. So financing the circular economy is really a bit of a focus of mine. And it's been a frustration. As I mentioned right at the beginning, a lot of what's happening in the circular economy front is relegated to grant financing and incubators, accelerators. Now, essentially post COP26, Conference of the Parties, what we've seen happening is we're starting to see alignment to global commitments. And for many years, I always said that we're never going to achieve the goals of the circular economy until we start making it count where it hurts. And that really is in the money, in the financials. So what we're seeing post COP26 is a different level of alignment, particularly around a more transparent environmental, social, and corporate governance reporting framework. So ESG reporting, those of you in the financial sector will understand that well, particularly your bigger clients are going to be critically focused on the ESG reporting. And that has changed substantially. So what we've seen in recent years, particularly post COP26, is the alignment of the international financial reporting standards. And that has also given birth to the International Sustainability Standards Board. And effectively what that does is it gives greater meaning, transparency, and reportability to ESG reporting. And we're seeing things, for example, from the likes of the EU Green Deal, and that's aligning to critical policies and structures that are going to impact every organization and every individual across the developing North, as well as in the developing South. So I will unpack that at a later stage. But if we look at where we are coming from, there's a lot of a requirement now for organizations to start looking at their scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. And that feeds into the ESG reporting, which feeds into their reporting standards and the sustainability standards. And effectively, scope 1 is direct emissions that are coming from company facilities and transportation within an organization. And a lot of companies are starting to look at that and have done their own investigations. But scope 2 and 3 are critically coming forward in terms of final reporting. And scope 2 is more your upstream activities, looking at your purchased heating, cooling, etc., but also your goods and services right through to your employees' commute. But then scope 3 is your downstream. And then effectively what that's going to do is that's going to attach to your supply chain as well. So looking at distribution, processing, end-of-life treatment, as well as your investments. So finances are starting to pay attention, because effectively now what it means is that this is being linked through to the global ratings agencies. So Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor, etc. And that's going to impact for every organization, every government, every corporate, every financial sector is going to have to be accountable with regards to their sustainability via scope 1, 2, and 3 and ESG reporting. So effectively, what this means is that it's aligned the spend, it's aligned the money to being responsible and being sustainable. And this is something we've been looking at for a long time. It's still got a way to go, but it's very encouraging to see where this is coming from. And I know a lot of the finances have kind of been put off by this and looking at it from a negative perspective. But I'm hoping after this presentation, you'll start to look at this more from a positive angle than a negative angle. So when you look at things like the European Green Deal, there are huge options in here with a number of different directives and policies that are looking towards this transition to a circular economy. Looking at everything from climate neutrality to farm to fork type opportunities. And it really is about transitioning to a circular economy. And a lot of that is towards creating a zero pollution Europe. And there's a lot of very key directives to meet by 2050. We're in 2023 already, and I think if we don't start doing a lot of work very soon, that's going to be a very difficult target to meet. But critically, it also incorporates what we call the just transition, and that really is leave no one behind. So if we look at the issue of equality in terms of the difference between the haves and the have-nots, it's that how do we bridge that gap, and how do we start to look at creating a transition that is going to work for everybody? And even within the European controls, they're looking at issues, for example, around this vision for inclusive rural areas, as well as the agenda between Africa and Europe. And that has been critical for us from an ASIN perspective, also trying to see how we move together with that. But there's a lot of different options here. We're seeing alignment with the likes of the European Investment Bank. There's this Sustainable Europe Investment Plan, green financing strategies, and there's just transition instruments and a whole host of other components around the financial sector that are really driving towards this component of assessing this sustainable future through the Green Deal moving forward. So linking this to a circular economy transition is really understanding the fact that this is linked to every sector. So please, this is not just about recycling and waste management. It incorporates energy, water, manufacturing, agriculture, mining, etc. And an important part of this is also looking at calculating the carbon, specifically around global commitments to the Glasgow Climate Pact, to the Paris Rulebook, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, UNFCCC, and the nationally determined contributions. These are all components that are going to affect the way that money works in the future. So in effect, this really is going to impact everyone. Corporates, banks, governments, but eventually the big corporates are going to require this to come through to their supply chains and their suppliers' supply chains. So the upstream and downstream is going to affect everybody in that supply chain. And we need to look at all those different components in terms of understanding that everyone has a role to play in terms of looking at sustainability going forward. If you look at this in terms of the South African context, for example, we have a carbon tax that has been put into place, and that's around about $9 a ton at the moment. And that increases constantly, and that's going to go towards a $30 per ton rate by around about 2030. And what we're seeing at the moment is a discount coming from the government, allowing corporates and governments and agencies to start to generate that alignment. But as that discount removes, we're starting to see the sector scrambling towards ensuring that they meet those requirements. So it makes sense, in any sense, to be more proactive in terms of where this is going. Keep an eye out with regards to how this is going to change absolutely everything in the future. And what it's going to mean is that those who don't pay attention are going to be left behind. And we need to make this transition work for everybody. And important in terms of this is that we're starting to see this rise of the global south. So developing economies are increasingly exporting to our own larger developing economies. And this is often termed as rising powers. This growth is quite impressive. Effectively, the developing economies' share of foreign value add has increased from 38.9% to 52.5% between 1995 and 2011 in China, and 45% to 60% in India, 32% to 47% in Brazil. In Africa's context, 52% of the continent's exports were to Europe in 1995, and that's decreased to 37% in 2015. So Africa's trade with developing economies has almost doubled from 25 to 50% in that same period of time. And what you're seeing here is something that is making people sit up and pay attention, particularly with regard to the fact that the global north has largely been dependent on the resources of the global south. And the global south is now becoming into its own with regards to understanding the south-south trade. And that really has a lot of impact with regards to understanding the future growth and sustainability of the global north. So pay attention to these. These are critical numbers that are going to impact financing on a global basis. And even if we look at this recently, there was a recent BRICS. So BRICS, for those of you who don't understand, is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and it's now called BRICS Plus. So I think there's about another 22 different organizations that have now incorporated into that. What this has done, the latest round, I think it was held in South Africa, shows that the manifestation and the desire of the Global South to claim their share in economic development is taking a leading role in global governance. And the BRICS are a force to be reckoned with and poised to shape the global world order. So countries of the political West, and particular European Union, are going to have to reevaluate models of cooperation development with the Global South to avoid losing those countries as crucial partners and remain viable and valid in the future. And some of the graphs and information that are coming through are quite eye-opening with regards to understanding this particular role. So finance also needs to take critical view on what's happening in the Global South. So the latest BRICS summit held in Johannesburg, there were 6 new members from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and a further 22 countries requested to join the bloc, with another 40 expressing formal interest. What that means is that this is close to the half of the world's population now makes up, which about 36% of the world's GDP. That's more than that of the G7. So that's a critical, essential move that people need to pay attention to. So essentially what that means is that the power of the Global South can surely no longer be denied on the big stages of world politics. And I think it provides critical opportunities in terms of investment. What I take out of that really is that the Global South is starting to appreciate its own resources and starting to understand the value that it has in itself. And there's great opportunities there in terms of financing. So what I've done is I've taken just a few examples in terms of some of the projects that I'm working on, just to try and understand how we can contextualize these practical applications. The first of which is looking at the development of low carbon construction using available waste materials. So in South Africa, we produce about 36 million metric tons of fly ash per year, and in the region of 4 to 5 million metric tons of metal slag. And there are billions of tons. So this is every year. We've been doing this for more than 60 years. So there are billions of tons sitting in landfills. But critically, these fly ash deposits contain what a lot of the world is talking about, critical raw materials. And China currently dominates critical raw materials with some 70% of the world's resources at its fingertips. And if we're transitioning to a green economy, we need to sit up and pay attention to that. South Africa used to be one of the globe's leading producers of rare earth 50 years ago. And unfortunately, that has not continued, but the opportunity in terms of the resources are there. Just in these ashes alone, there's about 1.2% of rare earth elements, as well as about 4% of silica cenospheres in those ashes. Through particular extraction methods, one can extract those rare earth metals at a specific concentration, as well as the cenospheres. And if we look at that alone, we're talking about $1.7 billion worth of rare earth elements and about $500 million worth of cenospheres. So it's quite a substantial investment opportunity. But as well as that, South Africa uses about 20 million metric tons of cement a year, but we only produce about 13 million tons locally. So that means we're importing 7 million metric tons of cement into South Africa. If you look at this from an investment focused perspective, there's an opportunity here to create in the region of 2,000 jobs per million tons with regards to investments in this. That would also look at about $500 million worth of offsets on imports and about nearly another $500 million in terms of local investment. Now that will help achieve some 90% carbon dioxide reduction in terms of investment into infrastructure. That brings us other opportunities in terms of looking at local refineries and building material developments, as well as addressing the issues around homologation, which is essentially the certification and compliance of different building materials into the existing system. These are not, this is not science fiction. So the little picture on the bottom right there is the largest alkali cement building in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment, I think. Built in Cape Town, 22 stories, using a blend of these alkali cements. It is the largest alkali cement building in the Southern Hemisphere, and it achieved nearly 60% reduction in CO2 emissions compared to conventional concrete. So this is a South African context. Understand there are hundreds of billions of tons landfilled globally. I've been speaking to the United States and other states. The opportunity is that these are sitting in landfills and they are globally polluting the planet, apart from the fact of their continuous cost in terms of management and oversight. Another big one is organic residues. And I take the context here from a South African perspective. In South Africa, we produce around about 44 million tons of organic residues per year. If you look at Africa, it's over 2 billion metric tons. And if you look at around about 11 to 15,000 tons per megawatt, in South Africa alone, that could give us nearly 3,000 megawatts of base power. And there we could look at gasification, anaerobic digestion, biochar, offsets and opportunities as well. The other opportunity in terms of that is looking at for each 1 million tons of residue, you could create about 700,000 tons of bioorganic fertilizer. Now, the opportunity behind that is that we're talking about a product that is about 50% of the cost of synthetic fertilizers, and that's a conservative assessment, which also brings in about 80% emission reductions as well as higher yields in terms of agricultural sector. But it also has multiple knock-on effects. Those effects are lower water requirement, higher yield, higher sucrose content, higher nutrient content, lower requirement of herbicides and pesticides, and again, all the associated costs with that. So through organic residues, there's an opportunity to create in the region of 2,000 jobs per million tons. And that's a great opportunity for Africa. If you look at South Africa alone, we have around about 25,000 square kilometers of abandoned arable land. That alone would give us great opportunities in terms of looking at understanding the options for things like regenerative agroforestry, as well as things like biomass sorghum, where one can actually grow energy. You can grow biomass sorghum that has an unprocessed calorific value of around about 19 megajoules a kilogram, which is not that far off of the coal standard of about 25 megajoules per kilogram for your thermal coal requirements. So again, if you look at the top two pictures, the wow is and the woof is not yay and dogs. It's about working on water and working on fire programs. Now, these are not just South African programs, these are global programs where there's a huge amount of alien vegetation that is eradicated in terms of securing water in the future, as well as managing fire and fire risk going into the future. And we haven't even looked at those volumes, and there's millions of tons of that come into the system that are normally openly burnt. But there's opportunities there. Let's look at small-scale technology, SME type development, micro off-grid electrification, or looking at it from an industry or a residential center perspective, or a mall. There's opportunities in terms of the benefits to the environment, increasing crop yields, as well as the benefits to human health and nutrition. And it's also going to divert landfill as well as offsets from open burns. And we can look at biochar as a secondary product that can add to soil carbon. And again, soil sequestration, if you look at carbon credits, there's quite a huge amount of that happening at the moment. And there's also, from a technology perspective, a number of biorefinery options for industrial development. If you look at biomass, there are a number of things one can create from that, including the likes of ethanol, but there are a number of different chemicals, wood oils and vinegars that can be created. Sugar, xylitol, for example, is extracted from timber waste. And then biomass sorghum provides us an opportunity to be able to look at actually growing energy. And a lot of people will say, but you're going to be competing with agricultural sector and food. I disagree. I think there's a balance. If you look at South Africa alone, the fact that we have 25,000 square kilometers of arable land that isn't being used, that's an awful lot of potential going into the future. And this is again not rocket science. There's a little picture on the bottom left. There are scalable, containerized type gasification units that can be used across the world. On waste energy, a similar sort of thing. In South Africa, for example, we have about 500,000 tons of problematic or contaminated plastics entering the landfill. That can be converted into about 350 million liters of fuel, which would offset about $400 million of imports and create around about 120,000 jobs in the country. Now, this is a big issue right across the world. If we look at the simple fact that our plastic comes from crude oil. Energy balance of crude oil is about 42.3 megajoules per kilogram. It's an energy intensive process to clean this nasty, dirty stuff into very clean plastic that you can drink out of, to the point where it's about 6 tons of carbon per ton of plastic that is produced by converting crude into plastic. And then we throw this plastic away. And the reality is that if you look at landfill, plastic in the landfill generates about another 3 tons per ton of CO2 equivalents. Problem is the plastic here is really sitting at about 46.4 megajoules per kilogram, and our coal average is 25 megajoules per kilogram. This is pure energy, and we're throwing it away. It just doesn't make any sense at all, particularly if you look at the fact that we have 650 million people on this continent without access to energy. So there's a whole host of opportunities. This is not, again, rocket science. The picture on the bottom left is actually the unit that one of my companies built and initiated, which used the waste plastic tailings from a recycling center to produce diesel, which ran all of the fleet of trucks. So it can be done. But there's all these different components that are coming through. We need to understand the skills that are required to bring this forward. We need to look at the just energy transition and understand that technology is taking off like a rocket. So pyrolysis, gasification, plasma systems, thermolysis, enzymolysis, and other chemical depolymerization systems are in play. And this applies continuously across the global south as well as the global north. And the last one is something around agroforestry. So I mentioned before, if you look at regenerative agriculture and forestry practices, we have 4.4 million hectares of deforestation annually, driven largely by the charcoal market in Africa. And again, that has massive biodiversity loss and impacts with regards to climate change, as well as loss of human life. If you look at the land use change and how that's affected, climate change is often the fact that you're getting a flood is because you've taken out the wetlands and the forests that used to retain that flood. And now we're blaming carbon because we've taken our trees and plants out. So we need to open up our eyes a little bit towards that. We need electricity for 650 million people. That's a nice big market for finances to look at. But there's also great opportunities for high quality lumber. This specific one we're looking at is a tree which is a deciduous broadleaf tree that, unlike most forests, does not create a desert, a biodiversity desert underneath it. One can use it for co-cropping. This picture is wheat. And we've looked at this with groundnuts, coffee, tea, and a number of other different components. So the land underneath does not become sterile. It becomes like a natural greenhouse. And there's carbon sequestration and offsets, and there's a lot of opportunities there. Putting that into context, for about every 1,000 hectares, it's about a $12 million investment, with timber height achieved in 5 to 6 years, providing 30 million profit by year 5. And on a rotational basis, would look at about $150 million after 10 years using 1,000 hectares. So there are a great number of opportunities in terms of looking at profit making in regenerative agroforestry that really incorporates communities. So this just transition is important. We can look at co-cropping. We're not going to compete with food, but also the leaves of these trees provide fodder. They're I think it's 13 or 18% protein, which means that they can be used for feeding cattle, goats, and sheep. And there's byproducts like honey, opportunities for carbon market offsets, etc. So there's a huge amount of opportunities in all of these different things. So in conclusion, financing the circular economy just makes sense. It's not just about waste. Circular economy affects and impacts every single sector. This global alignment is determining future financing trends. Pay attention because it's coming. It's there. And we're already seeing a massive move internationally in terms of investors away from unsustainable standards like coal and oil. So ensure you're not the one that's catching up because you're going to be left behind or worse. You're not going to be there. So let's look for the financial opportunities and not the problems, and be responsible. Look at this from a practical perspective. And essentially, the first mover advantage is going to determine who's going to be here in 10 years' time. Be that first mover, look at the opportunity, and try and see what you can do to look at investing into the circular economy. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Very, very interesting presentation, Chris. Thank you very much. So now we have several, we have some time left, and we have a few questions that perhaps, would really appreciate if you could address. First of all, I know that you have stressed several times that circular economy is not about waste processing, but I'm very much interested what needs to take place for investors to finally pay more attention to waste processing, waste to energy projects. I thought it's already pretty bad, especially in some parts of the world. What do you think, perhaps from the government or policies perspective, or what else, would improve the situation and incentivize investors?
There's a lot of things we need to look at. And I think we're seeing that from a European perspective, particularly around the alignment of the new Green Deal. There's a number of different directives. The alignment of the IFRS and the ISSB with ESG reporting is there. It's happening. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of educating the financial sector as well. It's always the fact that the financial sector is used to what it's been doing over the last umpteen years around a linear economy-based perspective. But we need to provide the governance and the frameworks around that. So from a government perspective, from a policy perspective, from a legislative framework perspective, we're starting to see that come together. The opportunities that we're seeing can also be scaled. So we need to look at these big opportunities around some of the ones that I showed you there. It is really just to understand that we're not talking about the hard sell here. We're talking about a soft sell. We're talking about an opportunity to invest in the future sustainably and still make money. And that's really what we need to do. The hard ones will come later. Let's look at the low-hanging fruit for now and invest in what makes sense. And it can be done at a number of different scales. And that's where we need to try and understand it. We're not looking at mass utility scale. Again, we need to move towards the just transition. So the fact that we're trying to look at building 1,000, 3,000 megawatt plants, which only massive corporates or governments can afford, should not detract us from the fact that if we look at investment into individual companies and organizations to become independent with their own power supplies, that provides a great opportunity as well from an investment perspective.
Great. Thank you. So another question, how is investing in resources from Africa linked to the EU's Green Deal?
If you put this into perspective, let's take South Africa again. Sorry for everyone, I'm from South Africa, so I know a lot of the different details here. If you look at the issue in terms of where we're coming from, we mine about 68 million tons of iron ore every year. 57 million tons of that is exported. Now, if you look at kind of what's happening with the new Green Deal, particularly around policies and carbon footprints, it no longer makes sense to take raw iron ore to Europe. First of all, you're not going to be able to manage in terms of the carbon footprint. Secondly, what do you do with the waste streams, and how do you structure that? So it's becoming more and more expensive. The opportunity, I think, is investment with regards to looking at resource development in the global south. Even if we look at it from I was involved with a Dutch mission last couple of weeks ago. And it really is looking at that whole issue of understanding that north-south connection and opportunities in terms of business developments. And green hydrogen was one of those components. And again, green hydrogen comes in a number of forms. So educate yourselves. There are not just mass scale, utility scale hydrogen development systems that are only the domain of the big corporates or the big governments. There are a number of fantastic technologies that can work at scale, at a factory, at a house. So how do we try and look at understanding those different technologies? But we critically need to look at this issue in terms of the fact that the linear economy, Europe was a net importer of raw material resources from Africa. That dynamic is changing, and particularly post-COVID with regards to supply chain issues and the shipping costs that have gone through the roof. So we need to change the way that we've done things in the past.
Right. Okay. The next question is, just give me a second. Let me find it. I can pull it up. Okay. What are some of the opportunities in investing in the energy transition? Examples.
Energy transition, I think, is quite an interesting one, because again, if you look at that from a scale perspective, it can be at the small scale. Some of the smaller gasifiers that I've seen run at 230 kilowatt output per container, up to about a megawatt per 40-foot container. They are stackable, they are modularized, they have an inbuilt engineering redundancy, which makes them more reliable than large-scale type systems. But it also means that investment into those is not just limited to the billions of dollars. We're now talking hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in terms of investments, which allows investors at a number of different scales to look at spreading their bets, spreading their risks, and looking at this from a multitude of different perspectives. So the just transition is about creating that link between the haves and the have-nots. So it's taking away from the utility scale options and putting it into the hands of the investors. If you see what's happening now, solar, for example, has taken off like a rocket. Solar does not need carbon financing at the moment. In fact, you can't get carbon financing for it at the moment because it's economically worthwhile by itself. But what you're seeing now is that people are financing, the finance houses are financing large-scale solar applications and selling energy. So you're now looking at a long-term energy commitment, which is easier now for a corporate or a mall or a big industry complex to now outsource their energy to a different company, and everybody wins.
Definitely can see that.
And another one, perhaps it relates to the previous question. Strategically, what are the best financial options investing in critical raw materials?
Critical raw materials are going to be vitally important in terms of moving forward. There's a lot of work that's been done with regards to looking at opportunities around materials as a service, which is a circular principle application that one's looking at, which is going to have a massive impact with regards to the resource base of the global south, as well as to the mining houses and the countries of origin. But when you look at the green transition, the simple fact, if you look at the global play that's happening with China's dominance over the critical raw materials side of things, is going to have a big issue with regards to global stability. And I think that's critically important, where we start to look at changing the dynamic and starting to invest in critical raw materials at smaller scales across multiple different regions to stabilize that. It's going to be good for the world. It's going to be good for investment.
Okay, great. And perhaps I'll try to combine those two questions to save time. So in case if we see more businesses and general population moving toward the circular economy, will it require changes in consumer behavior, and will the companies require new skills and positions for this transition?
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to take a critical look in terms of the skills. There's a lot of, unfortunately, I think what's happened is a lot of our tertiary institutions have pretty much become sausage factories, and we're pumping out a lot of kids out there who probably never going to get a job with the qualifications that they've got. And I think we need to look at those critical skills going forward. Artisanal skills are dying It's not just Europe, it's happening here in South Africa. Meetup Tori, please just type it in there. I can see the questions popping up, but people seem to be having an issue with the Q&A. So it really is a case of understanding, how do we future-proof? How do we understand what those skills, what skills are we going to need in 2050? That's where we need to be thinking now, is to understand that and critically look at those different opportunities. Technologies are becoming quite complicated. And it's going to be very difficult to plug and play a whole bunch of technologies if you don't have people who are going to be able to run them. So look for the right skills, understand future-proofing, and look at technology advancements as to where we need those skills in future.
Right.
Okay.
Also, Derek posted a question saying that Europe is already buying lumber from Africa. So how can we get Europe to invest in the reforestation of Africa?
I think there's a number of different reasons for that. So first of all, one thing I want to try and do is try and avoid the extraction of virgin forest, which is my focus area. There's a lot of work. I mean, I work with the big forestry organizations here in South Africa. We're all selling to Europe, and China and America and everywhere else. But if we look at the future demand and requirement, there is a greater opportunity to look at, from an investment perspective, a lower risk investment. So there are hybrid trees that grow to full timber height in 5 to 6 years, which provide a lower density, higher strength wood that has a higher value than pine or eucalyptus. So again, it's about understanding what's in the market. Where is my leading edge going to be? How do I make sure that I stay ahead of the pack? And we're seeing massive demand for these sort of resources, and it's not just within the global south, and you're seeing massive trade in the global south, but it's also the south north is huge opportunity. But if we look at regenerative forestry as a different opportunity that allows us to also look at food security and job creation under that canopy, it allows us a multitude of different ways of analyzing that from a future sustainability perspective that is going to reduce the inequality across the globe.
Great. Okay. Well, the next question is, do governments in Africa and what government, which countries are keen on developing waste to energy projects?
We're seeing that quite strongly come through. ASIN Foundation, one of my organizations, has been working with African Union Commission in terms of looking at alignment around circular economy roadmaps and structures and strategies. It has popped up constantly in terms of waste to energy as an opportunity. I know critically there are many in my organization who are more on the environmentalist side, who are very anti-waste to energy. But the reality is that if you look at these scaled type systems and the technology that's available now, waste to energy is no longer the domain of the mass scale incineration, heat and power plants. It's going to be the domain of the small scale systems, because you can't have a system like in Europe, Denmark, or in Rotterdam, where you have close proximity of people. Africa's a big place. There are massive stretches of land between different populations. So logistics is going to kill you. So smaller means easier, smaller means better, means from a risk mitigation perspective, it makes a lot more sense. And also in terms of looking at the security, to try and drive it from a microgrid perspective makes a lot more sense, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, which, on the African continent can be problematic from a sort of a control and corruption perspective as well, which, you want to try and avoid. But there's a massive opportunity, I believe, in investing into waste to energy in the right technology. Believe me, there's a lot of rubbish out there. So again, finances need to know what they're looking at. Don't jump into things with your eyes wide shut. Make sure you know what you're looking at.
Great. Okay, well, being mindful of the time that we already just finished an hour, there are still a few questions that we have, especially very long and comprehensive question from Jabulani, and also something from Stan. We will get those questions copied and respond to them. We'll send them over to you so you can respond in offline, so we don't keep people here for longer than we promised. just to wrap up, a quick comment that Lindsay Oliver shared, and I think it's very valid. It is imperative that reporting and oversight is taken seriously. If that happens, then we can act at business speed versus university and government speed, which is obviously very small. We complete green bonds and have spent a great amount of money to adhere to all oversight and reporting objectives here in Western Canada. So that makes sense. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. Just a quick reminder for those who joined a bit later. I have posted Chris's presentation several times in the chat, together with our presentation, also a link and my email address where projects can be submitted. And we really appreciate everyone attending, and really appreciate Chris sharing with us his wisdom and so much valuable information. Oksana, please also, if you want to say something.
Yes, well, nothing to add. It's very captivating. Really enjoyed the presentation. I love your passion, Chris. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much for all of our attendees. As always, we will send replay link. We know that people are from different time zones, so many can't join live, but they're looking forward to the link. So we will do that along with the presentation, because I can see in the chat many people say, well, you know, would like to have Chris's presentation. We will do that. Thank you very much. I'm wishing everyone a great day ahead, evening, or whatever time of the day it is. And Chris, thank you once again.
Only a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.